April 18th, 1942, early morning. The surface of the North Pacific was not blue, it was a suffocating lead gray. Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle stood on the wing of the bridge of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet, CV-8, allowing the salt-laden sea breeze to scrape across his cheek like a razor blade. The waves were 30 feet high. With every massive swell that smashed against the bow, the 20,000-ton steel beast let out a dull groan, the flight deck pitching violently in rhythm. Doolittle pulled the brim of his cap lower, his gaze piercing through the misty spray to settle on the flight deck. There, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat like a flock of giant birds trapped on a deserted island. Too large to fit into the hangars below, they had to be crowded onto the deck, tied down tight. Their wings interlocked, covering almost every inch of visible space. If this were a Hollywood movie, stirring military music would be playing. But in reality, there was only the howling of the wind and the occasional low rumble of engines warming up. "Colonel, wind velocity is increasing, gusts over 20 knots. Doolittle didn't turn his head. He knew that voice belonged to Captain Mark Mitcher. As a pilot who held a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, Doolittle understood what this meant better than anyone. For an aircraft carrier, this was bad weather. For Army heavy bombers attempting to take off in less than 500 feet, it was hell. But he had no retreat. 4 months ago, the smoke of Pearl Harbor had not only blackened the Hawaiian sky, but had all but incinerated American confidence. At this moment, the entire nation was like a boxer who had been dazed by a blow, desperately needing to throw a haymaker in return, even if that punch might break his own hand. Doolittle's thoughts drifted back to a few months prior, to the moment this insane plan was born. It all started in a tobacco-scented office in Washington. Back then, Captain Francis Lowe of the Navy's operations staff proposed an idea that sounded like a fantasy. If Army twin-engine bombers could launch from a Navy carrier, we could bomb the Japanese mainland. When General Henry Hap Arnold handed this mission to Doolittle, the ace pilot's first reaction was calculation. He was an engineer. He believed in data, not miracles. The B-25 Mitchell, wingspan 67 feet, maximum takeoff weight over 30,000 pounds. The runway on a carrier, when fully loaded with planes, left the first aircraft less than 500 feet for takeoff. Under normal circumstances, a B-25 required over 2,000 feet to leave the ground. This wasn't just a risk, it was a challenge to the laws of physics. "We need to find a solution to this impossible arithmetic problem," Doolittle recalled thinking, his voice in his memoirs calm to the point of coldness. Then came the frantic days at Eglin Field in Florida. Doolittle recruited members from the 17th Bombardment Group. They were a bunch of young, cocky, but highly skilled lads. When Doolittle told them he needed volunteers for a mission that was extremely dangerous, with little chance of return, almost every single one of them stepped forward. But the real challenge was just beginning. To save weight, Doolittle ordered every piece of non-essential equipment stripped. The expensive and top-secret Norden bomb sight was removed. It was useless for low-altitude, high-speed bombing anyway. It was replaced by a makeshift site improvised by Captain Ross Greening from 2 pieces of aluminum. It cost less than 20 cents, but at 500 feet, it worked surprisingly well. Even more insane was the removal of defensive weaponry. To save even a single pound for fuel, they removed the ventral turret. But to keep Japanese fighters from thinking the bombers were defenseless, they stuck 2 broomsticks painted black into the tail cone. Broomsticks, Doolittle smiled bitterly on the deck. We are about to challenge the Imperial Japanese Navy in planes armed with broomsticks. Back at Eglin Field, the most unforgettable figure was a Navy lieutenant named Henry Hank Miller. He was responsible for teaching these Army pilots how to take off like Navy men. Pull the stick back, stand on the brakes, full throttle. Miller's roar seemed to still echo in their ears. Wait until your engines feel like they're going to explode, then release the brakes. It went against every instinct of an Army pilot. At first, no one believed it would work. Not until Miller personally climbed into the co-pilot seat of a B-25 alongside Captain Edward York and made that behemoth slide less than 300 feet down the runway before rearing its head and charging into the blue sky. From that moment on, these Army boys truly began to believe that this impossible arithmetic problem might actually have a solution. On April 2, 1942, when the Hornet sailed under the Golden Gate Bridge, it was a foggy afternoon. It seemed God was helping them keep their secret. If the citizens of San Francisco could have peered through the fog, their jaws would have dropped. The deck of this brand-new carrier was packed tight with camouflaged Army bombers. It was the strangest fleet composition in history. Vice Admiral William Halsey's Task Force 16, including the flagship USS Enterprise and her escorting cruisers and destroyers, met the Hornet on the high seas. Only once the fleet was in deep waters was the tightly guarded secret announced over the ship's intercom. This force is bound for Tokyo. In that instant, the cheers nearly lifted the steel plates off the Hornet. Sailors threw their hats in the air. Some even began writing greetings to Hideki Tojo on the bombs. Doolittle looked at those excited young faces, but his heart was heavy. He knew that among these 80 airmen, many would likely never return. This was a one-way ticket. The plan was this: take off 450 to 500 nautical miles from the Japanese coast, bomb Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, and Kobe at night, then use the cover of darkness to escape. However, Murphy's Law of War is always in effect. If things can go wrong, they will. Back to the present, the morning of April 18th. All plans had been thrown into chaos hours ago. Radar operators reported an unidentified surface target. Shortly after, lookouts identified a small vessel in the morning mist. It was the Nido Maru No. 23, a Japanese armed trawler less than 100 tons, serving as a picket for Japan's outer defense line. Although the light cruiser USS Nashville quickly opened fire and dive bombers were deployed to sink it, the stubborn little Japanese boat managed to transmit a radio warning before going under. Doolittle didn't need a translation to guess the content of the intercepted message. The American fleet is here. At this point, they were still a full 650 nautical miles from the Japanese coast. Adding the doglegs in the flight path, the actual distance exceeded 800 miles. They were launching 10 hours ahead of schedule, with nearly 200 extra miles to cover. Every drop of fuel became a life-or-death gamble. If they didn't launch now, the main force of the Japanese Navy and Air Force would descend upon this precious task force. The U.S. Navy could not afford to lose its remaining carriers. If they did launch, the bomber crews would face the immense risk of running out of fuel and ditching in the sea or crashing along the Chinese coast in the dark. Admiral Halsey's order was flashed by signal light to the Hornet. It was a brief command filled with tragic heroism. Launch planes to coal. Doolittle and his gallant command, good luck and God bless you. Doolittle turned to his co-pilot, Lieutenant Richard Cole. The young man's face was written with tension, but his eyes remained steady. All right, fellas, Doolittle's voice was terribly calm. We're leaving early. The klaxon on the deck blared. Army pilots, man your planes! Army pilots, man your planes! This was no longer a drill. The waves were growing larger. The Hornet pitched violently between crest and trough. Sometimes the bow would heave high, pointing at the gloomy sky, only to smash down into the sea the next second, kicking up a sky full of white foam. Doolittle climbed into B-25 number 40-2344, plane number 1. As commander, he had to be the first to take off. It wasn't just honor, it was a tactical necessity. He had only 467 feet of runway available because 15 other planes were blocking the path behind him. If he failed, his burning wreckage would block the deck, and the entire operation would end. The cockpit smelled of aviation fuel, rubber, and sweat. Doolittle tightened his harness and checked the instruments. All the needles were jumping, as if the plane itself had a heartbeat. "Flaps down?" "Down," Cole replied. "Trim?" "Set." Doolittle slowly pushed the throttles of the two Wright Cyclone engines forward. The two 1,700 horsepower beasts began to roar, the entire airframe shuddering violently against the restraint of the brakes, like a wild animal desperate to break its chains. The deck launch officer waved a flag, waiting for the timing. He had to signal the instant the carrier's bow dipped to its lowest point and began to rise, so the plane could use the upward momentum of the deck to gain extra lift. Rain battered the windshield, blurring their vision. Doolittle stared at the flag in the officer's hand. The world seemed to stand still, leaving only the roar of engines exploding against his eardrums. The flag slashed down. Doolittle released the brakes. The B-25 shot forward, as if kicked. The massive bomber accelerated along the wet wooden deck, the needle on the airspeed indicator climbing agonizingly slowly. 10 knots, 20 knots, 30 knots. The left wingtip missed the island superstructure by mere inches. The sailors on deck held their breath, watching the silver-gray shadow rush toward the end of the bow. Too slow. To the onlookers, the plane didn't seem to have enough speed to generate lift. Just as the plane shot off the deck, the bow rose to its highest point. The plane left the deck, but it didn't fly immediately. Pulled by gravity, it dipped sharply, almost touching the churning sea. In that heart-stopping moment, Doolittle, relying on the instincts of one of America's top aviators, pulled back hard on the stick. The engines screamed, tearing at the air, the propellers seemingly vacuuming up the spray from the wave tops. The bomber, known as Plane Number 1, struggled like a clumsy but determined waterbird, leveling out just feet above the waves, then clawing its way up inch by inch. Seconds later, it stabilized and began to fly toward the western horizon. On the bridge of the Hornet, Captain Mitcher lowered his binoculars and let out a long breath. On the deck, a cheer erupted that drowned out even the storm, but Doolittle couldn't hear it. His gaze was locked on the unknown waters ahead. Behind him, 15 more planes were queuing up, 75 brothers who had entrusted their lives to him. Ahead lay 650 miles of angry ocean and the capital of an empire that had never suffered a foreign air raid. In that moment, James Doolittle didn't know he was flying into history. He only knew the numbers on the fuel gauge were ticking down, marking the countdown of his and his crew's lives. Once out of sight of the Hornet, the world consisted of only two colors: the gray-white of the sky and the deep blue of the ocean. For Doolittle and his co-pilot Cole, it was a suffocating solitude. Radio silence was absolute. To prevent the Japanese from triangulating their position, the flight dispersed immediately after takeoff, each plane finding its own path to the target. On this vast planet, the B-25 was but a speck of dust. During those 6 long hours, the only accompaniment was the tireless drone of the two Wright engines. Inside the fuselage, however, a more primal battle was being fought, a battle against fuel consumption. To extend their range, every B-25 had its crawlway stuffed with square, 5-gallon jerry cans. The job of Sergeant Paul Leonard, mechanic and gunner, was arduous and dangerous. He had to kneel in the narrow passage, pierce the tops of the metal cans with a can opener, like opening a giant tin of tomato soup and carefully pour the fuel into the main tank filler. The cabin reeked of nauseating high-octane gasoline. A single spark, even from static electricity, would instantly turn the plane into a fireball in the sky. "10th can finished, sir." Leonard's voice came over the intercom, gasping for breath. The empty cans couldn't stay on board as dead weight. Leonard had to open the belly hatch and toss them into the sea. Every time the hatch opened, a roaring slipstream blasted in, sending maps and loose items flying. Doolittle watched the fuel gauge. The needle was dropping faster than he had anticipated. A headwind, like an invisible hand, pressed firmly against the nose of the plane. According to Navigator Lieutenant Henry Potter's calculations, their ground speed was only about 150 knots. "At this rate, we won't even reach the Chinese coast," Lieutenant Cole whispered, his fingers drumming unconsciously on the map on his knee. Doolittle didn't answer, his eyes remaining as sharp as a hawk's. As commander, he could not show a shred of wavering. But he knew Cole was right. It was a race against the Reaper, and the Reaper was winning. However, as if in response to their anxiety, after 3 hours of flight, the wind changed. The strong headwind gradually died down, shifting into a tailwind, pushing them forward. This current, which the pilots would later call the Wind of God, or the China Wind, miraculously increased their ground speed. Time ticked away, minute by minute, until the monotonous sea finally changed. 12:15 p.m. A thin black line appeared on the horizon. As the distance closed, the line transformed into rolling green hills, with white surf pounding the coastline. It was Japan, Honshu, the Boso Peninsula. Doolittle felt his heart slam against his ribcage. Even the wildest dreamer would have found it hard to imagine this was really happening. 16 Army bombers had crossed half the Pacific to appear, unnoticed, at the enemy's front door. Ironically, when Doolittle's raiders arrived over Japan, Tokyo had just finished an air raid drill. It was Saturday noon. The weather was clear, sunlight piercing the clouds to shine on blooming cherry blossoms and tidy streets. The citizens of Tokyo, having just heard the all-clear siren, were stepping out of their homes to enjoy the weekend afternoon. Doolittle pushed the plane down to a breathtaking treetop height to evade potential radar detection. The B-25's massive wings swept over fields where farmers stopped their work to look up. An unbelievable scene unfolded. The farmers were waving. They smiled and waved at the silver twin-engine plane. In their understanding, this was a plane of the Japanese Army Air Service. After all, in this world, only Japanese planes flew over this land. Who could imagine that the wings bore not the red rising sun, but a white star? "They think we're putting on a low-level air show," Lieutenant Cole said in disbelief. "Stay sharp," Doolittle reminded him coldly. "The main event is coming." As the plane pushed deeper inland, the scenery shifted from pastoral landscapes to dense industrial zones. Forests of smokestacks and sprawling factories appeared. This was their target, the northern Tokyo Industrial Complex. In the distance, a few biplane trainers buzzed lazily, completely unaware that the Grim Reaper had arrived. At that moment, Japan's air defense system was in a state of shocking complacency. This was exactly the effect Doolittle wanted: surprise. But beneath the calm, Doolittle remembered the iron rule General Arnold had repeatedly emphasized during their briefing. You are absolutely forbidden to bomb the Imperial Palace. This was a strategic decision. Killing the Emperor would only whip the Japanese populace into a frenzy of revenge, making the war unmanageable. Their goal was to destroy Japan's war machine and shatter the myth of the homeland's invincibility, not to commit senseless slaughter. "Bomb bay doors open," Doolittle commanded. His B-25 had climbed to 1,200 feet. At this altitude, Captain Greening's improvised Mark Twain sight, the 20-cent aluminum device, proved surprisingly effective. Bombardier Sergeant Fred Bramer lay in the transparent nose cone, eyes fixed on the target below. It was a massive factory complex, smokestacks belching black smoke, clearly running at full capacity to produce weapons for the front lines. The crosshairs of the sight aligned with the target. Bombs away. It was 12:30 p.m., Tokyo time. 4 500-pound bombs dropped from the racks in sequence. Relieved of the weight, the plane leaped upward as if casting off heavy shackles. The first was a high-explosive bomb, followed by 3 incendiary clusters packed with dozens of M54 incendiary sticks. Seconds later, an orange flower of death bloomed on the ground. The explosion drowned out even the engine roar. Immediately after, the incendiaries scattered, raining down like a fiery blossom over the flammable wooden factory district. Thick smoke billowed instantly, piercing the clouds. Only at this moment did the anti-aircraft fire on the ground wake up. Black and white puffs of smoke appeared in the sky, flak bursts. The plane began to bounce in the turbulence, like driving on a potholed gravel road. "Flak is heavy, but their aim is off," Cole shouted. Indeed, the Japanese gunners were caught completely off guard. They couldn't accurately judge the altitude and speed of these bombers. Most shells exploded behind or below the plane. Doolittle gripped the stick, performing evasive maneuvers. He didn't look back at the sea of fire behind him. The mission was done. Every second spent lingering was just offering a target to the enemy. Full throttle, course 270, let's get out of here. Meanwhile, across Tokyo Bay, other B-25s were enacting the same drama. Every plane had its own story. Every pilot was writing a legend. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy, piloting plane number 13, targeted the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. It was a high-value military target. When they arrived, the dry dock held a light aircraft carrier undergoing conversion, the Ryuho. The deck was crowded with workers and cranes. McElroy didn't hesitate. It was a textbook target. The bombardier hit the button. A 500-pound bomb screamed down, punching precisely through the Ryuho's deck and exploding inside the hull. The massive shockwave tore through the steel plates, making it the first Japanese carrier damaged by U.S. bombers in World War II. In Kobe and Nagoya, other bomber crews were pouring out their vengeance. Steel mills, aircraft factories, oil storage tanks. The industrial arteries supporting Japan's war of aggression were being violently severed. Japanese fighters finally scrambled. A few Ki-27 Nate and Ki-43 Oscar fighters tried to intercept the intruders, but the Japanese pilots were baffled by the speed of the bombers. Having shed their bombs and excess fuel, the B-25s, diving at full throttle to escape, reached speeds of over 300 miles per hour. Combined with Doolittle's wise choice of ultra-low altitude flight using terrain for cover, the clumsy, older Japanese fighters struggled to get a bead on them. And then there were the famous broomsticks. According to post-war reports from Japanese pilots, they saw large-caliber machine cannons sticking out of the American bombers' tails. Fearing the firepower, they dared not approach too closely for tail attacks. It might have been one of the most successful psychological warfare tactics in history. 2 black-painted broomsticks scared off the aces of the Imperial Air Force. But for the Japanese high command, the real blow wasn't the damage to a few factories, but the psychological collapse. When the first explosion rang out in Tokyo, Hideki Tojo was handling official business. Upon hearing the news, the Prime Minister's face turned pale. This was more than an air raid. It was a crushing blow to the belief that the divine land is inviolable. For months, they had told the public that the U.S. Navy was paralyzed and that the Japanese homeland had defenses of steel. And now, in broad daylight, American bombers were circling near the roof of the Imperial Palace. The shame cut deeper into the military leadership than the physical damage of the bombs. By 1 p.m., all planes had completed their drops. Now, the carnival was over, and the real trial began. 16 B-25s fled desperately westward. They crossed the Japanese mountains, passed the coastline, and re-entered the embrace of the sea, this time the East China Sea. Destination: China, Cuzhou Airfield. However, just as at the start of the mission, luck became elusive. As night fell, the weather deteriorated drastically. The tailwind that had aided them turned into a massive storm. The clouds were as thick as a wall, completely obscuring vision. Rain hammered the fuselage like bullets. Worse, unbeknownst to Doolittle, due to a fatal communication error, they were flying blind into a pitch-black, rainy night. The fuel gauge needles were bottoming out. The red warning lights blinked like the eyes of demons. "Sir, we're running dry." Cole's voice held a trace of despair. Doolittle checked the panel. They had been flying for 13 hours. It was the limit of the B-25's range and the limit of human endurance. By now, they should have been near the Chinese coast, but looking down through the clouds, there was only endless darkness. No lights, no runway, only the roar of the storm. Doolittle faced his final choice. He couldn't ditch in the sea. With waves that high, it would be suicide. He couldn't continue flying blindly. The engines would flame out at any moment. He picked up the microphone, his voice retaining the authority of a commander despite his exhaustion. "This is Doolittle. All crews, we cannot locate the airfield. Climb to 8,000 feet. Prepare to bail out. Repeat, prepare to bail out." It was a heartbreaking command. They had performed a miracle, flown across half the globe, successfully bombed Tokyo, yet just a step away from safety. They had to abandon their beloved warbirds. The B-25 pulled up its nose, charging into the colder, darker clouds. Doolittle set the plane to autopilot. He took one last look at his loyal steed. Then, he opened the hatch and jumped into the vast, rainy night. Behind him, the warplane, numbering 40-2344, carried the last of its fuel like a meteor, crashing lonely into the Black Mountains. That night, for these 80 brave men, the war was just beginning. Doolittle felt like a rag doll slammed by a boulder. When his parachute caught in a pine tree, the violent jolt nearly cracked his ribs. He hung in the darkness for a moment, then cut the cords and fell heavily onto the muddy ground. The rain was still falling, bone-chillingly cold. Dead silence surrounded him, broken only by the occasional call of an unknown nightbird. Hours ago, he was the commander of a world-shaking fleet, piloting the most advanced bomber of the time. Now, he was alone, soaked to the bone, stuck in the mud of a foreign land. It was the morning of April 19th, 1942. Doolittle sat by a pile of rotting leaves and cow manure until dawn. As the morning mist lifted, he saw his surroundings. It was a Chinese paddy field. Terraces layered the hills, and distant mountains faded in and out of the clouds. Loneliness and a sense of failure washed over him like a tide. "It's all over," he told himself. All 16 planes lost. This was a massive asset of the U.S. Army Air Forces at the time. If this was occupied territory, his crewmen might already be captured or dead. He felt he would not only face a court-martial, but, more importantly, that he had failed the 79 young lives who trusted him. He stumbled down the hill and encountered a Chinese farmer plowing a field. The two men looked at each other. The farmer stared warily at this tall foreigner in a strange leather jacket, face smeared with oil. Doolittle nervously gripped his Colt .45, but he didn't draw it. "Japan?" Doolittle tentatively asked one word, pointing around and shaking his head. gesturing to ask if this area was Japanese-held. The farmer seemed to understand the word. His face instantly flushed red, an expression of anger. He waved his hand violently, pointing west, shouting in a dialect Doolittle couldn't understand. Doolittle let out a breath of relief. Anger meant this wasn't Japanese territory. He pointed to himself, trying the only phrase of Chinese he had learned in the briefing. Wo, shi, mei guo, ren. I am an American. The farmer paused. Then a smile bloomed on that wrinkled face, the most brilliant smile Doolittle had ever seen in his life. In that moment, Doolittle knew they had survived. Not just Doolittle. That night, the crews of 15 planes were scattered across the vast mountainous regions of Zhejiang and Jiangxi. At that time, although large swathes of China's eastern coast had fallen, countless resistance forces and ordinary civilians remained active in the vast mountains and rural areas. To these foreigners falling from the sky, the Chinese people showed a moving kindness and chivalry. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, who would later author the famous book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, suffered the most harrowing ordeal. His plane, the ruptured duck, crashed while ditching near a beach in Ningbo. Lawson's left leg was severely mangled, bone exposed and bleeding profusely. When he thought he was doomed, a group of Chinese fishermen found him. Instead of fleeing for fear of Japanese retaliation, they carried the large American, trekking arduously over rugged mountain paths. To avoid Japanese search parties, villagers organized lookout lines. They carried the wounded in makeshift sedan chairs, moving only at night. A Chinese doctor named Chen Shenyan performed an amputation on Lawson under primitive conditions, lacking anesthesia and proper instruments, saving his life. Throughout the rescue, whether guerrillas or ordinary farmers, no one ever asked the pilots for payment. They gave their last eggs and rice to the airmen, eating watery gruel themselves. Statistics show that of the 80 Doolittle raiders, 64 were rescued by Chinese soldiers and civilians and returned safely to the rear. It was a life-and-death relay race across language and race. However, not everyone was so lucky. On the flip side of the rescue lay the brutal reality of war. The crews of 2 planes inadvertently landed in Japanese-occupied territory. These American airmen witnessed the ugliest face of Japanese imperialism. In prisons in Shanghai and Nanjing, they endured months of inhumane torture. The Japanese wanted to know the launch point, wanted to know America's next plan. But these young men grit their teeth, repeating only the joke they had made on the carrier. We took off from Shangri-La. Eventually, in a fit of rage, the Japanese military violated the Geneva Convention and sentenced 3 of them to death. In October 1942, Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz were executed by firing squad in Shanghai. But a far heavier price was paid by the Chinese civilians who saved Doolittle and his comrades. Humiliated by Doolittle's bombing, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters flew into a rage. They realized that the airfields in Zhejiang and Jiangxi, along with the local rescue networks, were potential threats for future American raids. In May 1942, 1 month after the raid, the Japanese Army mobilized 53 battalions to launch a massive campaign aimed at destroying Chinese air bases and retaliating against the local population. It was a massacre. In the areas where Doolittle's planes had landed, the Japanese implemented the 3 alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. Any village suspected of helping American pilots was razed to the ground. Biological weapons were deployed in water sources and fields. For the lives of those 64 American pilots, an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were slaughtered by the Japanese Army in the following 3 months. This debt of blood became the heaviest footnote to the alliance between China and the United States during World War II. Among all these stories, the fate of one plane was particularly bizarre. Captain Edward York, piloting plane number 8, realized that due to a carburetor malfunction, his fuel consumption was alarmingly high. They knew they could never make it to China. York made a bold decision: fly north to the Soviet Union. Although the USSR was an allied power, it had signed a neutrality pact with Japan to avoid a two-front war. When the B-25 landed at a Soviet airfield near Vladivostok, the crew thought they were saved. But instead of flowers, they were met with internment. Stalin did not want to provoke Japan over a few Americans. The 5 crew members were detained for 13 months. Although living conditions were passable, they lost their freedom. It wasn't until 1943, with the tacit approval of the NKVD, that they escaped into British-controlled Iran via a staged smuggling operation and finally returned to the US. That lonely B-25 became the only surviving aircraft of the operation, remaining in the cold winds of Siberia, a witness to the complex era of great power games. May 1942, Chongqing. When Doolittle finally reached the wartime capital, he went to meet Chiang Kai-shek and General Joseph Stilwell with a heavy heart. He remained convinced he was a failure. "I lost all my planes," he told Stilwell. "I'm ready to accept a court-martial subpoena." Stilwell looked at the exhausted lieutenant colonel and handed him a telegram from Washington. "You've been promoted to brigadier general, Jimmy." Doolittle was stunned. What he didn't know was that, back in America, he had become a superhero. In the nation's darkest hour, he had lit the first fire of vengeance. Headlines screamed his name. His mission had pulled the entire United States out of the gloom of Pearl Harbor. But the more profound impact occurred on the other side of the Pacific. The moment the planes lifted off the Hornet, the gears of history were forcibly turned. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was recovering from illness aboard the flagship Yamato when the raid occurred. The news of Tokyo being bombed filled him with deep shame and dread. The nightmare he had always feared had come true. As long as American carriers existed, the Emperor's safety could not be guaranteed. This fear led to a major strategic miscalculation by Japan. Originally, there was internal debate within the Japanese military about whether to attack Midway. But after the Doolittle raid, all dissenting voices vanished. Yamamoto was convinced they had to push east, capture Midway, and lure the remnants of the U.S. Navy into a decisive battle to eliminate the threat to the homeland once and for all. And so, the main force of the Japanese Navy poured out. However, as we later learned, this hasty and angry offensive led Japan straight into an American intelligence trap. Just a month and a half after the Doolittle raid on June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway erupted. In this decisive battle, the Enterprise and the Hornet, which had bid farewell to Doolittle, joined by the Yorktown and commanded by Spruance, as Halsey was ill, sank 4 of Japan's main aircraft carriers. The tide of the Pacific War was irreversibly turned. The physical damage caused by Doolittle's few bombs may have been limited, but the strategic chain reaction they triggered ultimately buried the Imperial Japanese Navy. Time passed. The war ended. The lieutenant colonel who once took off from an impossible runway later became a 4-star general, commanding the 8th and 15th Air Forces. But for Doolittle, the most precious moments belonged not to an office in the Pentagon, but to every April 18th. The survivors of the Doolittle raiders had a tradition. They held an annual reunion. At these gatherings, there was a special wooden case containing 80 silver goblets, each engraved with a name. When a member passed away during the year, his goblet would be turned upside down. It was a silent farewell and an eternal vow. In 1993, James Doolittle passed away at the age of 96. In 2019, The last Doolittle raider, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, the young man who once sat in Doolittle's co-pilot seat pulling back the stick on that storm-swept deck, returned to the formation. He was 103. With that, all 80 goblets were turned down. At the end of this story, we need not list cold statistics. We need only remember that gray morning, that carrier struggling between the crests and troughs, and that group of young men who, knowing it was a one-way ticket, still charged unhesitatingly into the blue sky. As Doolittle wrote in his memoirs in his later years, "I don't think we were heroes. We were just doing our job. But if that moment needed someone to stand up and tell the world that freedom comes at a cost, and it is a cost we can afford, then I am honored that it was us." Today, the roar of the B-25 engines has long since dissipated in the river of history, but the echoes they left behind of courage, sacrifice, friendship, and the astonishing power of humanity in desperate straits will forever resonate over the Pacific.